Offense wins games, but defense wins championships. It's an adage almost as old as the sport itself, but the game is ever evolving. And now we're being told that the key to success in the NFL is actually to get a young offensive guru who can help mold and shape your quarterback. And if you define success in terms of Lombardi trophies, then you better grab yourself one of these head coaches. 4 of the last 5 Super Bowls have been won by a team coached by an offensive-minded head coach. Not only that, but the losing coach in every single Super Bowl since 2018 has had an offensive background as well. The only defensive head coach to make the Super Bowl in the past 5 years, that's going to be Bill Belichick, winning it all the way back in 2018 with Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. It appears as if success under the defensive mind has become a thing of the past, yet in the past 5 hiring cycles, we have seen 11 franchises hand their keys over to a former defensive coordinator, including 2 this past cycle. But why? If all signs are pointing to an offensive genius being the only way to win a Super Bowl, heck, to even make one, why are so many franchises still hiring these defensive-minded head coaches? To figure this out, I spent way too many hours collecting all sorts of information on every head coach in the past 10 years, which, if you're curious and want to check out, I'm going to put it in a link in the description down below. In the past 10 years, 83 men have had the privilege of being full-time NFL head coaches, which means no, I will not be counting interim head coaches. Of those 83, 48 have had an offensive background, 32 have a defensive background, and then I put John Harbaugh, Matt Rule, and Joe Judge into their own special other category because they either have a special teams background or a background in a mix of both. John Harbaugh, he influences that category so much just by himself that I'm really just not going to talk much about it. Out of the 83 men who have taken the helm of an NFL team in the past 10 years, 29 of them still are coaches, which is about 35%. And that number surprisingly seems consistent between each background. 17 of the 48 coaches are still active with offensive backgrounds, 11 of the past 32, and 1 of the last 3 other background coaches. But before getting further into this data that I have collected, I wanted to first talk about some background and why I think a franchise would even want to hire a defensive head coach. First, I think that the notion that defense wins championships and the mentality of a defensive-minded team is still something that NFL front offices and owners are heavily chasing. Bill Belichick and Chuck Noll have the most Lombardis, with 6 and 4 each, both of them defensive minds. Then you have Jimmy Johnson, George Sarift, Bill Parcells, Tom Landry, and Don Shula, all defensive guys who have won 2 apiece. In fact, of the 21 head coaches who have won a Super Bowl, 13 of them have been defensive guys. However, times are changing. Only 3 Super Bowl winning defensive head coaches are still at the helm today, as opposed to the 5 in the offensive category, plus John Harbaugh, king of the other category. In fact, since the turn of the millennia, there have only been 5 defensive-minded head coaches to hoist the Lombardi. Albeit, Belichick does make up 6 of those, so we'll get back to him later. But I want to get more specific. Earlier, I referenced that Belichick was the only non-offensive focused coach to even reach a Super Bowl in the past 5 years, much less win it. Let's identify the others then. You got Andy Reid. He's the godfather of the modern West Coast offense. He's won 2 rings and appeared in 1 more Super Bowl in the past 5 years. Sirianni, he came from the same tree, just lost to Andy Reid this past year. Bruce Arians, with the help of Tom Brady and the Chiefs' offensive line, was the one to hand Reid his defeat. Then you have the Shanahan tree, Kyle's Niners being defeated by the Chiefs back in 2020, Sean McVay's Rams losing to Belichick in 2019, but then beating his old offensive coordinator, Zach Taylor, in the Bengals in 2022. So, in all, there have been 7 coaches in the Super Bowl in the past 5 years, 6 of them being offensive guys. If you extend the window out to the past 10 years, you get the likes of Pete Carroll, Ron Rivera, Dan Quinn, and John Fox throwing their hat in for the defensive guys, while offensively you just get the additions of Doug Peterson and Gary Kubiak, which definitely balances out more, bringing it to a 5-8 deficit for defensive coaches to reach the big game, but also only a 4-6 difference in Lombardi trophies. Definitely not as bad. And it's honestly tough to know what entirely to take away from this. On one hand, we're bringing more data into the fold, increasing the sample size, and maybe saying, look, we're just in an outlier era in this past 5 years of this recent offensive success. It should swing back the other way. On the other hand, though, I do believe that the league is rapidly evolving, with the emphasis being on having a top offense, especially with the rule changes. And looking at the defensive teams that have won, John Fox's Broncos had MVP Peyton Manning. Dan Quinn's Falcons had MVP Matt Ryan, and Kyle Shanahan had an offense coordinator. Ron Rivera had MVP Newton. Pete Carroll had a young Russell Wilson, and Belichick, of course, had Tom Brady. Like, all of these are elite quarterbacks, elite offenses that were complemented by good defenses. I think, though, we do need to expand the sample size of our data, and the best way I see to do that is to look inside of these past 5 years where, as I said, everything is more modern and focused on offense rather than expanding backwards into different eras of football. So I began looking at postseason wins and appearances. Since the 2018-2019 season, 20 of the 35 offensive head coaches, so over 57%, reached the postseason at least once, compared to 9 of the 20 defensive-minded coaches, or 45%. Even if we remove some of the outliers based off of cap spending, which I'll go over how I determined who qualified later in this video, that's still 20 of the 29 qualified offensive coaches, just under 69%. Nice. Compared to 9 of the 14 qualified defensive coaches, which is 64-ish%. Of the 20 offensive coaches, 16, so 80% of them, have won at least one game, and they have an average win percentage of .423 and a median of .450. For the defensive guys, only 5 have won a game, 56%, and they have an average record of .27 and a median of .3. With offensive coaches taking up almost 25% more of the league, they are going to be more likely to find some postseason success, and especially in sports, it's so hard to predict the future based off of past events, but it's looking like that if you want to win in the playoffs, you're better off hiring an offensive guy just based off of this alone. So if defenses no longer win championships, why are we still seeing defensive coordinators being promoted to head coach? This question led me to my second assumption about defensive coaches. They must be safer or something along those lines. Bringing in a defensive guy must raise your floor, be good for the locker room, keep your team competitive, and not just be a laughingstock. You don't want to be the owner showing up to the meeting with the worst team in the league. And contrarily, an offensive coach could blow up in your face, and we've seen it happen recently. I mean, just these past 2 years, Urban Meyer and Nathaniel Hackett were disasters. So, yeah, it kind of makes sense. And when you start to look at the numbers, you can kind of see why you get that vibe. Andy Reid is the only offensive head coach who has coached continuously in the past 10 years. While we have 3 defensive guys who have done so, 4 if you don't ask who Ron Rivera was for the last 4 weeks of 2019. And it doesn't stop there. Looking at the careers of everyone who's been a head coach in the past 10 years, not including interim, of course, a defensive head coach's career is significantly longer at an average of over 7.5 years compared to a little over 5.5 years average for an offensive coach. However, something caught my eye while looking at the head coach's career lengths. If you count just the past 5 years, which I know, very shrunken sample size, and now we're only talking about really small numbers, but the average defensive coach has been active for 1.8 of those years, while offensive coaches are sitting at 1.9. This may be insignificant because of the small sample size, but I do think that it's interesting that offensive coaches have at least closed the gap, apparently. But why? Has something changed recently? Well, yes. I've already talked about how offensive coaches are finding more success in the playoffs, but they're also winning more regular season games, too. Offensive coaches have an average win percentage of .472 over the past 5 years, up a bit from the .467 mark they'd earned over the previous 5. I also decided to include the median in this data to try to remove some outliers, and the median also rose from .484 to .492. Compare that to defensive coaches, and that's where you see the issue really forming. As if 10% representation in the past 5 Super Bowls wasn't bad enough. Defensive coaches appear to be getting worse, having an average win percentage of .425 and a median of .4 in the past 5 years compared to an average of .440 and a median of .429 over the previous 5. Not only does this suggest that defensive coaches are getting comparatively worse, but it also suggests that proportionally, there are more bad defensive coaches than bad offensive coaches. The win percentage of defensive coaches has a positive skew, which means that there are fewer coaches that are above average versus a negative skew, which we see with offensive coaches, where there are fewer coaches below average. What this means is not only do defensive coaches have less regular season and postseason success on average, but you're more likely to hire a worse than average defensive coach than you are to hire a worse than average offensive coach, if we're going strictly based off of regular season win percentage, and you can assume what's been true in the past will translate to the future, which are two pretty big ifs. However, every coach is dealt a different hand. Take last year, for example. The Bears were not a good team, and much of that blame could be placed on first-year head coach Matt Eberflus. Or you could recognize that Eberflus wasn't expected to succeed in year one. It's a clear rebuild year. In fact, the Bears only spent a little over 37% on active players, so I figured I could try to get rid of some of these outlier coaches. I took the percentage of average cap hit by active players, so not including dead cap and players on the IR, per coach, and I removed any coach that fell into the bottom 25%, as most of these coaches were not set up to succeed. This list includes names like Eberflus, Brian Flores, Robert Saleh, Dan Campbell, Hugh Jackson, and more. Doing this, you can see that it's not as bad as it originally looked for these defensive coaches. As you can see, they're still doing worse than the offensive coaches, but their average median and win percentage both climbed these past 5 years compared to the previous 5. And as a reminder from earlier in this video, playoff appearance percentage also climbs when you remove the outliers. Unshockingly, Adam Gase is the only outlier coach to reach a postseason since 2018. But what's notable is how the gap between offensive and defensive coaches does shrink, going from about 59 versus 45% to about 69, nice, versus 64%. And I think there might be a genuine reason for that. If a defensive coach can do one thing, it's come in and reset a culture, right? A defensive coach can come in, take his team lost at sea, and settle them in, even if they aren't the ones who eventually take them to the promised land, right? Well, that's what the narrative seems to be at times. If we're going by win percentage, though, it doesn't quite appear to be that case. In their first years as head coach, offensive coaches hired pre-2018, so have coached in the past 10 years, have an average record of roughly 8-8, and those hired since 2018 have a record of 7-9-ish, which is honestly better than what I was expecting considering some of the recent coaches we've seen. And if you're adding the numbers and realizing that it's not coming up to a clean number on screen, it's because of the recent 17th game edition and some coaches not lasting their whole first year. I just averaged the number of wins, losses, and ties, and this is what came up. Flipping over to the defensive side, coaches hired before 2018 have an average record of roughly 7-9 in their first year, and those hired in the past 5 years actually average now a 7-10 record. This isn't a major difference, but I've heard the narrative that defensive coach can really come in and set the culture, and that's why you want to hire one as a rebuilding team. But I think that really has a lot more to do with the coach's personality and mentality. Like, look at the Lions and tell me that they don't have a much better culture now under Dan Campbell than compared to when Matt Patricia was there as their coach. While on the subject of turning teams around, I decided to look at how long, on average, it takes each coach to reach the playoffs for the first time. However, there just really honestly wasn't much of a difference, with offensive coaches hired before 2018 and made the playoffs at least once, taking an average of 2.25 years, while defensive coaches took 2.44 years. And for coaches hired after 2018, it's 1.25 years for the offensive guys and 2 for the defense. But the sample size is so small, and we had 3 first-year coaches make the playoffs this past season, and only 2 defensive first-time coaches have gotten hired since 2018 have making the playoffs, which is Mike Vrabel and Brandon Staley. So I gathered this data, so I figured I'd share it with you guys anyways, but it appears that the speed of which the rebuild turns around does not really matter between offensive and defensive coaches. While winning games is the most important thing a coach can do, I also think that it's important to look at the accolades of both the coach and the players. First, let's look at Coach of the Year, which unsurprisingly leans towards offensive coaches, taking home the trophy 60% of the time in both the past 5 and 10 years. Defensive coaches have won the award 30% of the times in the past 10 years, but down to only 20% of the time in the past 5 years. thanks to John Harbaugh winning it in 2019, bringing the other category up to 10% and 20% in the past 5 years. If you haven't noticed yet, the sample size of this award is incredibly small, and with these awards typically being a close race, I honestly don't see this as a big indicator of offensive coaching being superior as it appears at first glance, especially when you consider that just short of 60% of all coaches have been offensive, so it adds that 60% of them take home this hardware. MVP really paints a similar story looking at the past 10 years with a 50-40-10 split, but it does become more interesting when you look at it in the past 5. Tom Brady has been the last player coached by a defensive head coach to win the MVP all the way back in 2017. So no one coached by a defensive head coach has won the MVP recently. I was honestly ready to chalk this up to small sample size again, but Josh Allen and Russell Wilson have been the only recent MVP candidates who were coached by defensive coaches. And in Josh Allen's case, he had reigning Coach of the Year Brian Daboll as his offensive coordinator. So it appears that, unsurprisingly, if you want an MVP level quarterback, you need MVP level top tier offensive coaching. I also wanted to see if there was any notable influence over offensive and defensive player of the years, but it doesn't appear to be so. In the past 10 years, offensive and defensive players of the years were both won at the same rate, 60% offensive and 40% defensive, similar to the split of offensive and defensive head coaches. In the past 5 years, though, offensive player of the years did change to 80-20 split, but honestly, that's literally a change in one award. So if the award voting went different one year, it would be 60-40 again. So it seems that these awards are a lot more independent of the coach's background. Next, I wanted to see if coaching background had a significant effect on having a top tier offense or defense. Hey, so just a quick note. I went back and was wrapping everything up, finalizing everything, when I decided to double check some of these numbers, and I realized that these points per games are including playoffs, so just take that into account when I'm talking about everything from here on out. As you can see, it's pretty evenly split, with the rates of the top offenses hovering around that 60-40% split in the past 10 years. However, when you cut it down to the past 5 years, it starts leaning a lot more back towards the offensive coaches, which feels like a result of all these recent offensive coordinators leaving their defensive teams. I mean, you got Kyle Shanahan, Matt LaFleur, and a ton of others. But defensive coaches definitely show their values on their side of the ball, having a proportionally higher rate of number 1, top 5, and top 10 offenses in the past 10 years and 5 years. However, it's clear that having a top offense is way more important than having a top defense if you want to win it all. Last year, the top 2 offensive points per game met in the Super Bowl, with the number 1 Chiefs taking down the number 2 Eagles. A top 2 point per game offense had made the Super Bowl in 9 of the past 10 years, winning 5 of them. 7 of the last 10 Super Bowls had a top 5 offense, including 4 of the last 5. Compare that to defense, where top 2 defense only made 2 of the last 10 Super Bowls, the last time being in 2017 when the Patriots took down the Falcons. In fact, we see a kind of dramatic switch following that Super Bowl. From the 2014 to 2018 Super Bowls, 4 of the 5 champions had top 5 defenses, but in the past 5 years, not one top 5 defense has even made the Super Bowl. Even if you want to make the playoffs, having a top offense is way more important than having a top defense. In the past 10 years, 77% of teams who had top 10 offense made the postseason, compared to only 73% of teams with a top 5 defense. In fact, the number 1 defense in 2017, the LA Chargers, completely missed the playoffs. They did only have the number 3 defense, to be fair, before playoffs started. And the numbers in the past 5 years show even more of a discrepancy, where 82% of top 10 offensive teams made the playoffs, compared to only 69% of teams with a top 5 defense. Also, just to clarify, the reason why I am using a top 5 defense versus the top 5 offense is just to further stress the difference that even having the top 5 defense, or having like the 5th ranked defense, is worse than having the 10th best offense, at least statistically based off of what we've collected here. So based off of their postseason success, you might assume that defensive coaches have their team picking at the top of the draft more often. However, the number 1 pick leans a tiny bit more offensively recently, but each pick is a 10% change, so keep that in mind. Looking at the top 5 picks over the past 10 years, it's pretty close to the distribution of head coaches, but when you change that to the past 5 years, the numbers start to skew a lot more towards offensive coaches. Top 10 picks over the past 10 years, however, go the other way, with defensive coaches ending up there 46% of the time, despite only representing 39% of the coaches. Once again, though, we see a shift towards offensive coaches in the past 5 years, with 58% of top 10 picks belonging to offensive coaches and 34% to defenses. Almost dead on the general distribution of coaches, but a definite switch from the trend set by previous years. So it would appear that there honestly isn't much of a difference at the bottom of the draft between offensive and defensive coaches, but there is at the top of the league a pretty big difference. And based off of everything we've talked about so far, it seems all the modern trends are pointing towards hiring an offensive coach. They're winning all the Super Bowls. They have better regular season and postseason success, win more games in year one. Having a top offense leads to better success than top defense. And having an offensive guy doesn't put you at a much greater risk of being an abysmal team. So, what gives Houston and Arizona? Why did they hire DeMeco Ryans and John Gannon? We all know that the NFL is a copycat league, and honestly, I think that's precisely why teams still are trying on defensive coaches. They want to zig while everyone else is zagging. They want to be the ones being copied. The league is constantly changing, and we've seen some dramatic differences in the past 5 years alone. And maybe this trend of offense is here to stay. I definitely lean towards that it probably is, but maybe it's not. Maybe one of these guys is going to figure out how to be the best coach in the league despite being a defensive background like Belichick was able to. Each coach brings something unique, and we really can't just look at these numbers and make these sweeping foregone conclusions. Like, we can look in the past and be like, okay, this is what happened, and use that to inform our decisions going forwards. But these coaches are humans. They can be the exception. We can definitely say right now we're at a golden age of offensive football. And as long as we're in it, it might seem best to go after an offensive guru. But one day that's going to change. And these teams are trying to be the ones to change it. Just like Derrick Henry, he bucked the running backs don't matter trend. That trend was gaining more and more steam. And he proved just as valuable as ever. And in this past year, I think we started seeing the shift back towards the running game. And DeMeco Ryans, he could turn into the next great coach in Houston, see a shift back toward hiring defensive guys, and defense wins championships. There's a chance that we are already seeing a defensive coach like that over coaching Derrick Henry in Tennessee. All right, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If I could ask for 2 more seconds of your time just to drop a like to help push this video out to more people, I would be greatly appreciative of that. If you want to stick around and see what other content I'm going to be making, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. What do you want to see next? Follow me over on Twitter at Zach_party, and I'll see you all next time.